6 a.m. in Brittany's Morbihan region, and Louis Ganet's up at the crack of dawn to milk his cows, a task he carries out 7 days a week.
There are 40 of them to milk today. My herd is made up of around 50 cows.
Originally from sunny Marseille, this 35-year-old moved to France's rainy northwest and quit life as an economics teacher for a taste of the countryside. 4 years ago, he became a dairy farmer in the tiny village of Languedic.
I wash the udders so that they're clean when they're connected to the machine. Milk is a food product, so you can't let anything contaminate it. It has to be as pure as possible.
And sometimes that means milking the cows the traditional way.
We haven't lost the old techniques. They still work.
But this is no carefree rustic idyll. Like all farms, it's a business on which Louis depends for his livelihood. With milk prices plummeting over the past year, he's been losing money.
At 27 cents a litre, I'm producing at a loss. I'm working for nothing. And on top of that, I have to pay for the electricity for all the machines. That's expensive.
In October, disaster struck. 30 of Louis's cows died of unexplained heart attacks, and his debt spiraled out of control.
One day I got a phone call from the bank. They said they were going to close me down because I couldn't pay my debts. I had no future, no hope, no life. There was no point in working. And I didn't want to live anymore. I found myself in the barn over there, on my knees, crying as hard as I could with a noose around my neck. My head was spinning with dark thoughts. Then I don't know what happened. I suddenly realized I had to milk the cows.
Louis says he'll never understand what brought him back from the brink of killing himself.
Thank God I didn't go through with it.
Louis is not alone. An increasing number of indebted French farmers have been attempting or committing suicide.
Since I've been here, there have been six colleagues who've taken their own lives. It's tragic.
The basilica at Saint-Anne-d'Auray is the largest pilgrimage site in Brittany. Since 1625, Catholics from around the world have been coming here. They believe it was the place a Breton peasant witnessed the apparition of Jesus Christ's grandmother. For the past 30 years, the Vatican's allowed clergy to bury suicide victims.
I've had to do that. I've buried agricultural workers, most of them young. It's a sickening experience. Sickening. What should I say to help people, to touch people? It's horrible. Really horrible.
Among the faithful is local personality Jacques Jeffredo. Last October, the 56-year-old former vegetable farmer raised eyebrows when he set out 600 polystyrene crosses on the basilica's forecourt.
It was quite a windy day. The crosses are only light, so some of them were blown over. It was an image of agriculture today. Farmers are falling one by one as they go bankrupt or, alas, commit suicide.
The most recent official figures put the number of suicides in French agriculture at between 150 and 200 a year. Jacques says the real number is closer to 600, nearly 2 per day. His gesture was appreciated in this rural community.
There was a special atmosphere that day.
Oh, it was you, the crosses.
The 11th of October, yes.
It was beautiful.
It was beautiful?
Very touching.
Touching? Moving?
A lot of people in my family have committed suicide.
How did you feel when you saw the crosses?
It was very moving for me. I think it was moving for a lot of people here.
Jacques wants to sound the alarm on a recurring problem which for him symbolises the plight of modern farmers.
Before, people had small farms and they helped their neighbors out. They lived comfortably off their earnings. There were village fetes and real solidarity. Now it's all changed. Society demands that we produce more and more for the lowest possible price. So farmers look to expand. They want to grab their neighbor's land. And so your neighbor becomes your enemy. The atmosphere's really changed.
Over the past 25 years, 2/3 of France's small and medium-sized farms have disappeared. Those who work on them are more alone than ever, living in fear of debt and failure. Of late, the frustrations boiled over into violent protests, like here in Plérin in the north of Brittany. Last winter, the price of pork skydived, and crisis-hit farmers vented their anger at the regional pig market. 6 months later, calm's returned, but inside it's still a buyer's market, pitting producers against big-name distributors out for a bargain. The price of pork is back up, but it's not enough for many farmers.
The problem is we don't have enough weight with the distributors. They don't care about our production costs. We wish they'd give us more leeway.
The recent crisis has seen farms go bust, production plummet. This just as demand from China increased. Another irony in a sector vulnerable to the whims of the global market.
The number of pigs on offer decreased, so that's why prices started to go back up again. That's the market. The laws of supply and demand decide everything.
More than half of France's pork output comes from Brittany. The industry is subjected to increasingly stringent health and environmental regulations, meaning extra overheads for producers. On his little pig farm in the centre of the region, Hervé Guillaume explains.
This building was constructed to comply with European animal welfare rules that came into force in 2001. They said pregnant sows have to be housed together. These ones are going to have their piglets in 10 days.
France is the EU's biggest agricultural producer, but its farms are under pressure from competitors where costs are lower and rules not always as strict. In order to be in profit, Hervé needs the price of pork to increase by another 5 cents a kilo. At the moment, however, he has no choice but to sell at a loss.
A living pig is worth nothing. It's only worth something when it's dead. So we're at the mercy of the abattoirs. If I don't sell 200 pigs every 3 weeks, I have no room for the ones that have just been born. It's like a conveyor belt. Piglets at one end, fully grown pigs at the other. And they have to go to the abattoir.
With margins tight, Hervé produces most of his pig feed on site to avoid dependency on the big providers.
My goal is to make savings wherever I can. We produce and process our own cereal and use the manure from the pigs as fertilizer. That way, we're less vulnerable to changing pork prices. We have to produce at the lowest cost possible, and this system allows us to do it.
High-end organic farming it isn't, but Hervé's found a way to compete with an outfit that's small and mostly self-sufficient. Yet state officials, co-ops and banks are demanding farmers expand and modernise, and that means taking on more debt. In Brittany's far northwest, we meet Sylvain, a young farmer who's followed that very model. 3 years ago, he took over the family business, bought more land and built a state-of-the-art cowshed equipped with all the latest gadgets. They allow his 150 cows to milk themselves.
So the cow goes in, the machine identifies her and cleans the udder.
Size, weight, yield, all the cow's data is automatically stored in the system. Sylvain has no regrets over his investments.
One machine costs about 100,000 euros, so I paid 340,000 for these 3 machines. It gives us a lot of flexibility, a lot of information to follow up on. And in the future, we want to take on staff, so this will help us figure out their work schedule.
900,000 euros spent and an extra 4 litres of milk per cow per day. Impressive, but not enough in the current economic climate.
When I took over, I bought the farm over there. We expanded the herd. So Granddad's old cowshed was too small. The problem was we based our budget on a price of 320 euros per 1,000 liters of milk. We thought that gave us room for maneuver, but it hasn't at all.
What's the basic price now?
265.
Right now, the farm is producing 4,000 litres of milk and losing Sylvain €220 every day. Father Georges has spent his whole life here and watched the profession evolve. These days, he says, farmers can't just milk cows. They also need to study geopolitics.
Here in Brittany, we're right on the edge of Europe. But we're dependent on what happens in Asia, what happens in the United States, and in Brazil. It's impossible to predict. These days, you have to know about everything, which you didn't when I started.
Further complicating matters is the EU's embargo on Russia over the war in Ukraine. Subsidies, European, national and regional, are in place to help. For the average French farmer, they represent 11% of turnover. But with them comes a mountain of paperwork. And Sylvain says he spends half his time in the office.
You have to do it. You don't have the choice. We're talking about large sums of money, so you can't afford to make a mistake because the future of the farm depends on it. And then there are all these orders handed down from the bureaucrats, people who just don't know what it is to work out on the field. So putting their orders into practice often proves impossible.
But this 29-year-old who's about to become a father says he wouldn't work anywhere else.
We've got a setup that works well, so we have to look to the future, how we can develop and do it better.
Back in Longuedic, Louis has given up on maximising output. He's been converting his farm into an organic operation and hopes to receive official certification soon. He says the process hasn't been easy.
Our so-called partners in the sector tell us you need to be in perfect financial health to set up an organic farm, but that's nonsense. It's also about gaining autonomy, and I think that's why they try to discourage us.
But Louis is embracing the challenge. He says it's restored his faith in farming and helped chase away his demons.
Here I am in the fields with my cows. I've bought a few new ones and more are on the way. But above all, I'm alive and I'm going to continue.
Critics say France's agricultural model has failed to adapt since the post-war boom years. Farms are getting bigger and more high-tech, but not compared to some of their overseas competitors. Earning a decent living, or any living at all, is tough, even though some are finding ways to survive.
I'm joined now by one of the journalists behind that report, Chris Moore. Chris, now you really showed there a breakdown in some of France's rural communities. Did you get a real sense of that when you're out and about filming in Brittany?
I think, first of all, it's important not to have too stereotypical view of the past. It wasn't all cider and village fetes back in the day with kind of jovial, rustic people enjoying themselves together. But there have always been problems. But now, as we saw in our report, French farms are getting bigger. A lot of the smaller and medium-sized ones have been killed off. And that is a situation which can create tensions. They're under a lot of pressure, these farmers, to increase the size of their farms. That can mean, obviously, perhaps coveting the neighbour's land. There's a potential source of conflict there. And at the same time, some of the smaller farmers we spoke to said they tend to get on pretty well with other smaller farmers, not necessarily so much with the big boys. These are relatively traditional farming communities as well. Some of those big boys I was just talking about are actually from families who've been farming the Breton land for generations. A lot of them have followed the model, if you like, the authorities have really asked of them. They have expanded, but at the same time, perhaps very little time for newcomers or some of them who they see as idealistic farmers or organic farmers coming into this environment. There's no sense of physical conflict on the ground, but there are tensions there against the backdrop, as you said, of a farming crisis.
Now, farmers committing suicide is clearly horrific and clearly a drastic problem. Have French authorities underestimated this, do you think?
I think the problem is really that nobody knows the true figure. These suicides, this wave of suicides, got into the headlines during the peak of this crisis back in the winter. The most recent study actually dates back as far as 2007. That was the one that gave the figure of 150 to 200 suicides a year. A lot of people, including our friend Jacques Jeffredo, they estimate it as much higher. He says 600. There's no official figure that's anything like that high. Anecdotally, talking to Louis, who you saw at the start of our report, he said that in the very small part of Brittany in which his farm is based, he's known of 6 suicides in the past year. So it does seem if you start panning these figures out on the national scale, the figure is perhaps much larger than the authorities have so far acknowledged. What does seem to be the case is that another study needs to happen pretty soon, first of all, to establish the true figures and to establish why it's happening. There is a helpline in place, a telephone helpline for farmers who feel really at the end of their tether, but without a new study, we're not going to find out exactly why.
Thanks very much, Chris Moore, for bringing us today's reporters. And that's the end of this programme. Do join us again next time here on France 24.